Okay, so picture this. It's 1916, the Eastern Front of World War One. You've got this young Russian soldier huddled in a freezing trench, and his rifle's useless.
Useless.
Yeah, useless. He's got no bullets.
Oh, wow.
And get this, he's not alone. A full 25%, a quarter, of the Tsar's army went into battle this way. Ill-equipped, some even unarmed.
Wow. So this wasn't just like some, military oops. This was a sign of a much deeper problem within Tsarist Russia, a problem that was so bad it eventually led to the collapse of the whole empire.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today, the factors that brought down this giant. We're sifting through historical accounts, expert analyses, even some pretty chilling firsthand stories.
It's one of those stories, that's both fascinating and kind of scary. It really shows how even powers that seem untouchable can just crumble. And I think one of the biggest things that gets me is the sheer size of Russia. Like, just try to imagine it, a nation that stretched from Poland all the way to the Korean Peninsula.
So we're talking like 13, 16 time zones?
Yeah, at least.
It's hard to even picture that. It's bigger than all of Europe. I mean, the U.S. had trouble building one transcontinental railroad, and Russia would have needed 5 times that.
Exactly. And that difficulty brings us to one of the big issues, Russia's struggle to industrialize. While the rest of Europe was moving forward, building factories, growing their infrastructure, Russia was still mainly focused on agriculture.
So they just didn't have the industrial base to support a modern army or even like effectively govern a territory that massive.
Right. And then you have the internal issues. Over 80% of their population were peasants, lots of them still basically tied to the land, which wasn't technically serfdom, but it was pretty similar.
So you're working constantly just to get out of debt, but there's no real chance of a better life. I mean, it's the perfect recipe for simmering discontent.
Exactly. Then you add in this idea of Pan-Slavism, which, it's not something you hear a lot about today, but it was a really powerful force back then. It was basically this idea that Russia was like the protector of all Slavic people.
Which, of course, put them at odds with Austria-Hungary for control of the Balkans.
Right. And Pan-Slavism is so important here. You have this really potent combination of nationalism and religious identity that just fueled tensions in the region and pushed Russia closer to war. And at the head of all of this, you had Tsar Nicholas II, who lots of people thought was well-intentioned, but just totally in over his head.
It is kind of wild how one person's personality can shape the fate of entire nations, like with Nicholas. I love how you described him as a stubborn Ned Flanders.
Hmm.
It really fits, because he seems like he was a decent guy personally, but just so stubborn, especially when it came to Serbia. And that stubbornness dragged Russia into a war they were just totally unprepared for.
And his leadership, or, well, lack of it, is really a key part of this whole story. He kept replacing competent ministers with people who would just do whatever he wanted. He even became his own, favorite general. You have to wonder, how much do individual personalities determine what happens to entire systems?
It makes you think. And the war itself, World War I, was completely catastrophic for Russia. By 1916, they had suffered over 7 million casualties.
7 million? Wow.
Yeah, that's more than twice the population of Utah. Just imagine that. The loss, the grief, the despair.
Unbelievable. And the soldiers didn't even have basic equipment, not enough food. They didn't even have warm clothes. Like, picture being sent to the front lines wearing a summer uniform when winter hits.
Oh, it's just...
It's awful. And of course, that's when the desertion started, which made the army even weaker and just demoralized the entire country.
And it wasn't just the front lines that were struggling, was it? Back home, things were pretty bad too. Food shortages, inflation going through the roof, and it felt like the Tsar was just ignoring the people, the average folks who were hurting.
Yeah, it's like the war just made all of their existing problems even worse. I mean,
Yeah.
you literally had people starving in the streets while the Tsar and his buddies just partied on.
Like, come on, guys, read the room. And then on top of all that, you have Grigory Rasputin entering the scene.
Ah, yes, Rasputin.
This so-called holy man who somehow got the Tsarina totally wrapped around his finger. It's all very shadowy, isn't it? You've got rumors of mysticism, scandal, and it all feels like something out of a movie, like the royal family was under some kind of spell.
It's really interesting when you think about it. The way Rasputin gained power, it shows how fragile those in power can be, even when they seem untouchable. I mean, he took advantage of the Tsarina's desperation to cure her son's hemophilia. She just wanted him to be okay. And Rasputin, he positioned himself as this mystical healer, claiming a direct connection to God.
Which, of course, just made the public even more suspicious of the monarchy.
Oh, absolutely. The monarchy's reputation was already in shambles.
It's like something out of Shakespeare, right? War,
Yeah.
economic hardship, and a mystic pulling the strings behind the scenes. It makes sense that by 1917, Russia was ready to explode.
It was like a powder keg just waiting for a spark. And that spark, believe it or not, came from the women of Russia.
Really. The women.
Yep, it was International Women's Day, March 8th, 1917. Thousands of women in Petrograd, they just took to the streets. And these weren't like hardcore revolutionaries. They were mothers, wives, factory workers. They were just desperate to feed their families. And their message was really simple. We need bread, we want peace, and this war.
Wow, and they had the courage to stand up and say that, right to the Tsar's face. You know, it always seems to be the women who bear the brunt of hardship, yet they're often the first to speak truth to power. It's pretty inspiring when you think about it.
It really is. And those bread riots, as they're often called, they just spread like wildfire throughout the city.
And they led to some pretty major changes, right?
They sure did. The women, in their desperation, they accidentally started this chain reaction that brought down the Tsar. Like, just a few days later, on March 15th, Nicholas II abdicated. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled for centuries, was just gone.
That's a pretty clear reminder that power, no matter how strong it seems, it all depends on the trust of the people. And once that trust is gone, everything can change so fast.
Exactly. And it's a lesson that every leader should take to heart.
So the Tsar is out, but who takes his place? It wasn't a simple handoff of power, was it?
Oh, not at all. The revolutionaries, they were divided on what the new government should look like. On one side, you had the provisional government, made up mostly of liberals and moderate socialists. They wanted to establish a Western-style democracy.
Okay, so more of a gradual transition.
Right. But then you also had the Soviets. These were local councils made up of workers, soldiers, and peasants. And they were pushing for more radical change, like right now.
Ah, so you've got two competing centers of power. Sounds like a recipe for chaos.
It was definitely tense. The provisional government, they were stuck because they felt they had to keep fighting the war, but most Russians were just done with it. And meanwhile, the Soviets, especially the Petrograd Soviet, they were gaining influence. They wanted the war to end immediately, they wanted to redistribute land, and they wanted workers to control the factories.
It sounds like two completely different visions for Russia's future. On one hand, you have the folks who want a gradual shift towards democracy, and on the other, you have those who want a complete overhaul of society, both socially and economically. It's almost like they're speaking different languages.
And within those groups, there were even more divisions. Mensheviks, Bolsheviks, socialist revolutionaries. It was a real mess trying to keep up with it all.
It's like one of those choose-your-own-adventure books, but with a socialist revolution. Every choice leads to a different outcome. But in the end, it's the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, who take control. How did that happen?
Well, you see, Lenin had been living in exile, but he returned to Russia in April 1917 with a really simple and powerful message: peace, land, and bread.
Those are pretty powerful words when you're tired of war and hungry.
Exactly. And Lenin, he was a brilliant strategist. He knew how to turn the people's anger and frustration into a revolutionary force.
It just goes to show you, sometimes the simplest messages are the most effective, especially in times of turmoil. Lenin wasn't just giving them solutions, he was giving them hope.
Exactly. He was selling them a vision of a better future. And that, combined with his charisma and his unwavering belief in his own ideology, it made him the perfect leader for that moment. He saw that the provisional government's weakness was that they couldn't deliver what the people needed most. So he presented the Bolsheviks as the party of action, the ones who would bring peace, give the peasants land, and feed the hungry.
So his message really resonated, especially with the soldiers, sailors, and factory workers who were fed up with the provisional government. They were tired of empty promises.
You got it. Lenin and the Bolsheviks, they used this growing anger to their advantage. They organized strikes and demonstrations, and then, in October 1917, they staged a very well-planned coup d'etat. They overthrew the provisional government and started a whole new chapter in Russian history.
That's a huge turning point. The October Revolution, as it's now known, completely shifted the balance of power.
Yeah.
But I guess that wasn't the end of the story, was it? Because then a brutal civil war broke out, turning brother against brother. This civil war, the Red Army against the White Army, I mean, it was just brutal, devastating.
Absolutely.
It wasn't even just a war for territory. It was like a war for Russia's soul, a war that left wounds that still haven't fully healed.
Yeah, you think about it, entire villages caught in the crossfire, families divided by their beliefs, millions forced from their homes, starving, sick. The human cost is almost impossible to grasp.
And as if that wasn't bad enough, The rest of the world decided to get involved, right? They saw
Huh?
communism spreading, and they freaked out. So they sent troops and supplies to help the White Army. It just made everything so much worse.
I think the Western powers, they had good intentions, at least in part. I mean, they were genuinely afraid of what would happen if Bolshevism spread across Europe.
Sure, they were scared.
But by getting involved, they just played right into the Bolsheviks' hands. It fed this whole narrative of, a capitalist conspiracy against the revolution, which drove Russia and the West even further apart.
It's like a textbook case of how trying to fix things from the outside can actually backfire. You just end up making the problem worse.
And imagine what it was like for the Russian people. They'd already been through years of war, hardship, political chaos, and then on top of all that, they get caught in this global power struggle. It must have felt like the walls were closing in.
So, finally, after years of this brutal fighting, the Bolsheviks win. They consolidate their power, crush their opponents, and in 1922, the Soviet Union is born.
Hmm.
But did they actually deliver on those big promises? Peace, land, bread? Was it really a better world?
Well, the first few years of the Soviet Union were this crazy mix of change and repression. The Bolsheviks, they were following Marxist-Leninist ideology.
So they're trying to build this whole new socialist society.
Right, and they made some huge changes. They nationalized industries, took over agriculture, tried to erase class differences. It was all supposed to create a fairer society. But instead, there was chaos, economic hardship, and people pushing back at every turn.
It's like this sad pattern that repeats throughout history.
Hmm.
You have a revolution, usually with good intentions, but then it turns into something else entirely.
You hit the nail on the head. The Bolsheviks were so convinced that they were right that they couldn't tolerate any opposition. They created this massive, scary security apparatus, the Cheka, which later became the KGB. They wanted to silence anyone who disagreed with them. Millions were thrown in prison, executed, sent to forced labor camps in the Gulag. It was horrific.
It's chilling, really. It reminds us that power, even if it starts with good intentions, can go really wrong really fast, especially if it's not held in check. The Soviet story is both ambitious and tragic and has lessons for us today.
Big time. It shows what can happen when utopian ideals are pursued without pragmatism, compassion, and respect for individual rights. The fall of the Tsars and the rise of the Soviets, it's a complex story full of twists and turns, victories and defeats. And it still speaks to us today. It makes us think about power, ideology, and freedom, and how they all interact.
It forces us to look in the mirror, to think about the choices we make both as individuals and as a society. We're facing our own challenges today, challenges that echo the past in a lot of ways. So I think it's important to remember the lessons of Tsarist Russia. We need to protect our own freedoms, build a world that's fair and compassionate, and never forget what happens when power goes unchecked, especially when it's driven by extreme ideologies.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And maybe, most importantly, we need to keep talking to each other, even when we disagree. We need to understand history, understand why people do what they do, and remember that we're all in this together. There's a quote by a Russian writer, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He said, "The line dividing good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart."
Wow, that's a really powerful thought and a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the fall of Tsarist Russia. We hope you learned something, maybe thought about some things you hadn't considered before, and maybe even felt a little uncomfortable at times. Because sometimes that's what it takes to really learn. So until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep learning.